All right, everybody. It's time for us to discuss the Sylvester Stallone film from 1982, First Blood. This isn't one that I have seen addressed in any college courses except this one being taught by me. But it should be because it's a darn good film and it fits right in there with the stuff that we have discussed in the class so far. As far as having the protagonist, or perhaps protagonists, plural, fit the mode of the tragic hero, as far as the notion of the internal flaw, and it's just a very thoughtful, well done film in general. Now, this was produced in 1982, if I'm not mistaken. I might be off by a year, but I think it was 82, based on a novel written by David Morrell. Morrell spelled like the mushroom, again, if I'm not mistaken, in the mid 70s. And while this film bears a lot of resemblance to the novel, it also differs from the book in some pretty crucial ways, including one way that is extremely significant. Now, that having been said, I'm not going to tell you what that most significant way is, since we are not, at least in the course for which I'm recording this video, we are not reading the book. And actually, if we were reading the book, I still wouldn't tell you because I'd want you to find out for yourself. Let's start off with some trivia here. The role of Colonel Troutman, which, as you've seen, was a very big one in the film, was originally given to Kirk Douglas. And Kirk Douglas was on set, they were ready to start filming, everything was ready to go. And Kirk Douglas talked with or sent a letter or something to the producers, or the director, probably both, saying, I think we need to make a crucial change in the script. And the producers and directors responded and said, no, I don't think we're going to do that. And so Kirk Douglas left. He got in his car and just left. And the change that Kirk Douglas suggested, well, that change would have been much more in line with something that happens in the book, and artistically, it might have made significantly more sense. But let's put it this way, Sylvester Stallone has made hundreds of millions of more dollars by their not making that change. So I won't tell you what it is, but if you read the book, you'll figure it out right away. Well, you'll figure it out once you finish the book. And what else here? So the role of Colonel Troutman suddenly was unfilled. Richard Crenna, Richard Crenna, I don't know why I couldn't get his name right there, was apparently at home on a Saturday, and he got a phone call from his agent saying there's this movie that is being filmed, and there's this role that needs to be filled. Would you be interested in this role? And Richard Crenna thought, oh, well, I'd go audition for the role. And he said, yeah, sure. And his agent said, great, you've got the role. You got to be on a plane tomorrow night. So that's how that happened, which I think is kind of cool. Also, Brian Dennehy, who plays Sheriff Teasle in the film, also played Willie Loman, the main character in Death of a Salesman, in a pretty acclaimed Broadway, I think, production of Death of a Salesman. Quite some years after First Blood, but I think that's a nice bit of coincidence for our class. A couple of terms that we need to know before we get into this movie. Symbolism. Symbolism is the use of a thing, whether it is an object or a person or an action, to suggest or fill in for, to be an analog for, as it were, some other concept or thing or action or person or idea. Did I say idea? Well, if I didn't say idea, I should, because that's what we have going on here. There is at least one bit of very substantial symbolism in this movie, and it starts pretty early, and you've seen it. It is when Rambo crosses the bridge. In literature, bridges nearly always represent crossing from one situation into another. They're not just things that you walk on to get over a chasm or a highway or a ditch or whatever it is. And when Rambo crosses the bridge both times, after Teasel has driven him across it to get him out of town, and Rambo walks back across it, and then much later in the film, when Rambo drives across that bridge back into town, both of those represent Rambo really moving from one course of action, one potential outcome, one potential fate, so to speak, to a different one. Another word for us to keep in mind here. Foreshadowing, which somehow I can't spell. Foreshadowing is when an object or a person or an event or a line of dialogue suggests something that is to come. Now, often we don't recognize foreshadowing until after the thing has come to pass. And then we go, oh, hey, yeah, that one line or that one thing that happened way before that. Yeah, that kind of suggested this. But there are other instances in which we recognize foreshadowing just almost immediately. For example, in this film, when Teasel is on the radio after Sheriff Galt has fallen out of the helicopter and Teasel is radioing back to town and says, get that chopper back out here. I don't want Galt's body out here all night. And the guy on the radio says of the helicopter pilot, he won't come, Will. He says there's a storm headed your way. Now, within the context of the film, the storm is just a weather event. But, in literature, upheaval in nature very often equals upheaval in human affairs. Think of Snoopy's novel. If you're old enough, you maybe know Snoopy's novel, which consists of, it was a dark and stormy night. Suddenly, a shot rang out. The maid screamed. A pirate ship appeared on the horizon. As far as I can tell, that's all of Snoopy's novel. But it was a dark and stormy night. That's a classic line, and it is there because, as we said, upheaval in nature equals upheaval in human affairs. A storm, when things are violent and frightening and dark in the weather, means that things will be, metaphorically, as it were, stormy and violent and dark and scary in human affairs. And indeed, things get very violent and stormy and dark and scary in human affairs quite shortly after this line in the film. Now, foreshadowing is, well, ironic foreshadowing. This is a cousin or a type of foreshadowing. Ironic foreshadowing occurs when a line or an event or a character, something, suggests the direct opposite of what is to happen. If you've ever watched any horror movies, let's say there's two teenagers in a house and there's a weird sound from the basement. Well, the male teenager nearly always says, I'm going to go see what that is. I'll be right back. And we all go, oh, no, you silly boy, you won't be right back. Because we've seen enough horror movies or we know enough about those conventions to know he's going to go down to the basement and get murdered. So that's ironic foreshadowing. Now, in this movie, there are several instances of it. One of them is when Teasel, in his police car, has pursued Rambo, who's stolen a motorcycle, and Rambo, gets away out in the country, and Teasel is called for backup, and he's standing there beside his flipped-over police car, and Teasel's sort of talking to himself. He says, we'll get him. No problem. Oh, my goodness, you silly, silly man, Teasel. That's ironic foreshadowing because, as it turns out, getting him is an enormous problem, and they don't actually get him. They only get him because he eventually gives up, as you know. There were other instances of foreshadowing in the film, such as when Teasel has arrested Rambo near the beginning of the film, and he finds the big knife on Rambo, a knife that does not exist in the novel, by the way. And Teasel says, what do you use this for? And Rambo says, hunting. And Teasel says, don't be a wise guy. What do you hunt with a knife? Well, turns out Rambo's going to hunt him and the deputies with a knife in pretty short order. And let us see, another instance of direct foreshadowing is when the deputies are going through the woods and they've all got their automatic rifles. Have you noticed how extremely well armed the sheriff's department is? For what's supposed to be a quote, small town hick sheriff's department, that's a line from in the movie, they sure got a hell of a lot of semi-automatic weapons and such around, don't they? And a lot of staff. I don't know, kind of odd to me. But anyway, they're moving through the woods, and Mitch, that's the young red-haired deputy, played by David Caruso, who, as you know, would go on to star in NYPD Blue, and then ultimately have a long tenure in CSI Miami, where his thing was to take off his sunglasses and talk like this about whatever is happening. Kind of a quasi-Clint Eastwood thing. Anyway, they're moving through the woods, and Mitch says, "We ain't hunting him. He's hunting us." True enough. That's exactly how things turn out to be. This movie is no more a realistic representation of the typical experience of a Vietnam veteran than Hamlet is a realistic depiction of life in medieval Denmark, or than Oedipus Tyrannus is a realistic depiction of life in ancient Greece, which is to say, not terribly realistic. But it's more realistic than either of those plays. It's not nearly as realistic as Death of a Salesman, because Death of a Salesman is painfully realistic. If you have ever had serious financial troubles, if you have ever had to live paycheck to paycheck and found those paychecks were not enough, and I've been there, I am there actually, then you know that Death of a Salesman is crazy realistic in the sorts of struggles and whatnot that Willie and his family have to go through. So First Blood is not that realistic. But what First Blood does is it takes the experiences and problems that were commonly faced by folks returning to the States after extended combat tours, and it amplifies them. It makes Rambo sort of the epitome of the veteran who has returned to society and finds that there isn't a place for him here anymore. And the reason there's not a place is because his experiences in combat have changed him irrevocably. I don't think irrevocably is quite the right word, but, get out your thesaurus, type in irrevocably, and you'll probably find what is the right word. Hell, I'll just do that now. Irretrievably, irreversibly, there we go, or permanently. Well, hell, that's even a much easier one. Well, what are you going to do? So Rambo's experiences in combat have changed him irreversibly, or permanently, in other words, a much better word, probably, from the person he was before he went into combat. And when we talk about the ways that Rambo has been changed, and when I say he is sort of, the epitome of the person, the combat veteran who comes back to society and finds that he or she doesn't really fit anymore, this gives us an opportunity to discuss things that are not specifically mentioned, or at least not specifically named in the film. In that final scene where Rambo is having a meltdown in front of Colonel Troutman, and he's going on about how sometimes he doesn't talk to people for days or weeks, and he has nightmares, and he can't hold a job unless and so. Well, clearly that Rambo is suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Post-traumatic stress disorder, I don't know when the toim was kerned. I don't even know when the term was coined. But it was not something that was commonly diagnosed in the 70s, certainly, which is, when the film takes place. It was made in 1982, but clearly it depicts someone who is existing in the mid to late 70s. And post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, was not a thing that was commonly or maybe ever diagnosed at that point. The closest term, the closest concept that folks had of it before then was shell shock, which, same thing, just shell shock means a slightly more isolated or more narrow sort of PTSD, I think. And we know that post-traumatic stress disorder is a very real thing. And it's not confined to people returning from combat. Folks can develop PTSD in response to any and all kinds of traumatic situations. Terrible childhoods, one horrific incident in their adulthood or their childhood. Doesn't have to involve people shooting at them. It doesn't even have to involve assault, although it can. Once, when I was at Mayo Clinic, not working there, I was there, well, I wasn't in a patient capacity, but I was there with someone who was. A nurse told us that he had PTSD, and he got it from working at Mayo, especially in the emergency room. But here's the thing about that, unfortunately, and I'm quoting the nurse, unfortunately, no one gives a shit unless you developed it in combat. That statement is far more true, I think, than I wish that it were. So this film gives us a chance to talk about PTSD. Now, we're not going to do that at great length. This is just an example of how literature, as mimesis, as an imitation of life, can bring up things that directly relate to life, and then we can ponder them. We can be more aware of them. Also, the film more sort of obviously puts the plight, not just the mental or emotional plight, but the physical plight of combat veterans when they return home, onto our radar. There are lots of folks who return from combat, and whether from PTSD or other health problems they have developed, burn pits and the serious problems that they cause have been in the news not too long before I make this video. And you don't have to go look up burn pits, although I urge you to do so. But there are lots of folks returning from combat who are kind of screwed because apparently veterans hospitals are not all that. Now, I don't know. I've never been in one. I have never served in the American Armed Forces, so I've never had to avail myself of the services of a veterans hospital. But the reputation in general is not very high, and that's not me trying to denigrate any veterans hospitals that are good. I'm not trying to denigrate anyone who works at veterans hospitals, who really tries and knows what she or he is doing. That's the general reputation. And a lot of veterans have serious problems when they come back. This film gives us an opportunity to think about those things. It also gives us an opportunity, especially after the end and Rambo's meltdown in front of Troutman, to think about reactions to the Vietnam War. Rambo is talking about when he returned to the world, and at the airport people were protesting and spitting and holding up signs and so forth. And I remember this crap from the news when I was a wee one. We would see on the news, scenes of people protesting, returning veterans at the airports, and dead bodies, coffins and stuff coming back from Vietnam. The news is pretty sanitized these days. We don't get to see coffins. We're shielded from the sight of Americans who have been killed in combat, and that's probably a bad thing that we are shielded from that. And that's just my opinion. So I'm certainly not going to ask you, on the exam, is it good or bad that on the news anymore we don't see the bodies of service folk who've been killed? I'm not going to ask you that. But let us think about that. Would there be such widespread general acceptance of whatever conflict the United States gets into if we were allowed to see the fallout from that conflict? I'm not sure. And I'm not saying that there shouldn't be widespread agreement, nor am I saying that there should. But I think it's an issue that the film, obliquely as it were, raises for us to think about. Another issue the film brings up in a very serious way, we see when Rambo is in the forest before he is found by the deputies, and before my phone goes off and makes a really irritating sound, when he leaps down from a tree with his spear and kills a razorback hog. The proliferation of razorback hogs in the American Northwest. Didn't know that was a thing. That's not a thing, and I'm just kidding. That's not an issue that the film gives us an opportunity to bring up. It's one of those things, actually, that is sort of painful because you're like, oh, I don't think that's a thing. I don't think Razorback hogs in Washington State is a thing. Maybe it is, but I've never heard of it. Same way with all the explosions. A lot more explosions in this film than in any work that we have covered so far in the course. And this is all Hollywood stuff, right? I mean, if aut delectare aut prodesse, if a work of literature needs to entertain and enlighten, the explosions and all that sort of thing, they're on the entertainment side rather than the enlightening side. Whereas all the issues and stuff that we just talked about, those of course relate to enlightenment, things that we can think about and become aware of that maybe we weren't so aware of before. Okay, what else here? The conflict, the types of conflict in the film. Well, obviously there's lots of person versus person. There's Rambo versus Teasel. There's Galt versus Rambo, and on and on. Rambo versus the guy driving the army truck, whose name I can't recall, and so forth. But there is also person versus environment, and I would argue this is the biggest sort of conflict in the film, because Rambo is essentially at odds with all of life, everything and everybody in it. That doesn't mean he's constantly fighting everything and everybody in a physical way all the time. But as we said, he has returned from combat permanently changed from how he was before he went into it. And we don't know how he was. We don't get any information about his backstory. But I think it's safe to assume that he was not the guy before that he is after, because he has that line in his meltdown with Troutman at the end of the film. You don't just turn it off. And by it, he means that killer instinct, that assessment of everything around as a possible threat that one has to eliminate all the time. Okay, that sort of battlefield awareness. You don't just turn it off, he says. It wasn't my war. You asked me. I didn't ask you. So, there's some bitterness there. And the bitterness seems to be, it, right? That you don't just turn off. He has it now, and he can't get rid of it, although he wishes that he could. Now, when I say he wishes that he could, that sounds a little bit like I'm stepping over that line, because there's a fine line we have to walk between talking about literary characters as literary characters and talking about them using ideas and terms and so forth that the work itself suggests and we can support by looking at the work. There's a fine line between talking about them that way and talking about them as real people with real motivations and reactions and histories and memories and so forth. And this is a line that it's very easy to slip over, especially when the literature that we are talking about, that we have read or watched, is very well done. And if we're watching it, if it's very well acted. Because, really good writers and really good actors do that. They give us the impression, the mimesis, the imitation of actual human beings, even though, what we're seeing are just characters. So I think that Rambo's line, you don't just turn it off. It wasn't my war. You asked me. I didn't ask you. And his subsequent, talking about how crappy life is for him now, I think we can pretty easily read this as his wishing that he were not this way, as his wishing that he had not had the experiences and training and whatever that has made him into the person he is now, which in turn suggests he wasn't always this person. So I think that's a fair assessment there. Feel free to disagree, but I think that's fair. So we've covered themes, kind of, ideas that the work gives us a chance to think about. And my air conditioner just came on, so we now have to deal with that roaring in the background for a while. And I apologize about that, folks. But I'm not going to stop the video and wait for the thing to quit and then pick up again. Here's an idea. Rambo as an outsider. This concept we see in various ways throughout the film. Rambo he's a drifter by himself. All the people that he served with in Vietnam, he is no longer in touch with, and one reason for that is because they're all dead, except for Troutman. In fact, the opening scene, which is another one of those things that shows this is a movie. Shows it, the opening scene shows a family with really hardcore Deep South accents in Washington State. Oh, I see. Intriguing. And Rambo has come to this place where his friend Delmore Berry, he thinks, lives. But Delmore doesn't live there anymore. Delmore is dead. He died of cancer. And Delmore was the last surviving guy other than Rambo and Colonel Troutman. And with him gone, and Rambo, as we learn later, not knowing how to get a hold of Troutman, Rambo is truly isolated. He's not just alone in the physical sense, which he was before. He's now even alone in his head. He doesn't even have the knowledge that there's someone out there who directly shares his experience. Now he is the last guy. He is clearly an outsider in the society of the little town that he enters. You know, Teasel picks him up and hustles him out of town because Rambo doesn't fit in. He said, we don't want guys like you here in this town. Next thing we know, we got a whole bunch of guys like you. That's why. Drifters. We're like, okay, didn't know that was a crime, but apparently it is. Now, vagrancy. Ooh, hardcore crime, vagrancy. What are you doing? Nothing. You're under arrest. Crap. So Rambo has had experiences that separate him from everyone else around him, and he's generally rejected by the people he meets. Even Delmore Berry's, I don't know, mother or wife or something, whoever the woman is that Rambo talks with in that opening scene, clearly is not friendly toward Rambo. She does not like who he is and what he represents to her, which is the death of Delmore. And Sheriff Teasel, quite clearly, is not friendly toward Rambo. Even though this is kind of interesting, there is a scene late in the film. It's when Teasel is back in town and he's sitting in his office. They all think Rambo's dead. And one of the deputies hears on the radio that Rambo is not. And the deputy hustles over to Sheriff Teasel's office door and opens it and says, "Hey, Will, that Rambo guy, he's still around." And Teasel stands up from his desk kind of slowly. In that scene, you can see to, I think, Teasel's right, behind his desk, a green thing, one of those green felt display deals with military awards, medals, and so forth on it. Teasel is a military man himself, which is kind of interesting to me because that means that Teasel and Rambo, to some extent, share experiences. But Teasel is not at all sympathetic to that. Not at all. As Teasel says during one of the arguments he has with Troutman, "You think Rambo was the only guy that had a tough time in Vietnam?" Okay, so Teasel and Rambo may share experiences. Maybe Teasel was in Vietnam. I don't know. We're not given any additional information about his having been in the military, except for one line when Troutman says, but what the hell, you're a civilian now. Now, meaning that Teasel wasn't always, but what conflict he was in, I don't know. Given when the film is set, and given Teasel's age at the time of the film, Teasel might have served in the Korean War, not the Vietnam War, not World War II. Teasel's still a little too young for that. Well, I guess maybe if he was in it when he was very, very young, but probably not. Anyway, I'm just speculating now, and that we have nothing to back that up, because as we say, we're not given any more information about Teasel's military background. So, Rambo is rejected by Teasel, even someone with whom, hypothetically, they have, a little commonality. Rambo is separated from Troutman because, they're separated physically. Rambo says at one point, "I tried to get in touch with you, but the guys at Fort Bragg, never knew where you were." And so even though Rambo and Troutman share very much experience, Rambo has not been able to get in touch with him, and Troutman is separated from Rambo and the rest of the guys who were in Rambo's unit because of Troutman's high status. And now, back in the world, as it were, Troutman's high status has put him in a position of security, a position of normalcy, as we define normalcy in American culture. He has a job, maybe he has a family, he has a life. He doesn't have to drift from town to town. And for whatever reasons, Troutman is not suffering from the PTSD from which Rambo suffers. Another thing that marks Rambo as an outsider, when he gets into town, he's in trouble. It's as though he is not in his environment anymore. When he enters town at the beginning of the movie, he immediately is hustled out by Teasel. When Rambo walks back into town, he gets arrested, and there's the whole fight at the jail and so forth. Things do not go well. Once Rambo leaves town after escaping from the jail, he's essentially in control, as we see, as he wipes out Teasel's posse when they go try to arrest him, after they've hunted him, including with a helicopter, in which the only real bad guy, the only absolute bad guy in the film, Deputy Gault, Gault, is how I would imagine it is spelled. Deputy Gault, the only out-and-out bad guy, falls to his death, his own damn fault, from the helicopter as he is attempting to murder Rambo. But after Rambo escapes from town, and after that incident, he's in control. He wipes out Teasel's posse. He is able to escape from all the folks that are pursuing him. He scares the hell out of the National Guard folks that have him cornered in the mine at one point. He's able to survive within the mine after the cave-in. And he's in control. As he says to Teasel when he's got him at knife point or knife edge, "In town you're the law. Out here it's me. Don't push it. Don't push it or I'll give you a war you won't believe. Let it go. Let it go." Yeah, that's my awful Sylvester Stallone impression. But in town you're the law. Out here it's me. So Rambo's in control when he's not in town, when he's out in the wilderness, in his element, so to speak. But then late in the movie, he re-enters town. And although he scares the hell out of everybody while he's in town and, blows up a power, power converter or two, whatever those big things are that are at the top of phone poles. Or power poles. What are those? Converters? That's not the word, but I can't think of it right now. If you've ever seen one of those explode in real life, by the way, it's pretty spectacular and freaky. Anyway, despite the havoc that Rambo wreaks in town, he's still in trouble, and we know he's going to get brought down eventually, as we find at the end of the movie. When he's in the sheriff's office, he's taken out Teasel, he's spread havoc throughout the town, but the sheriff's office is surrounded. To quote Troutman, "There's nearly 200 men out there and a lot of M16s. If you don't end this now, they'll kill you." Yeah, so when Rambo's in town, he winds up in trouble. When he's out of town, when he's by himself out in the wilderness, he's in control. So this also marks Rambo as an outsider. So let's now think about Rambo in terms of Aristotle's description of the tragic hero. Well, like Willy Loman, he holds a very low social status, which is the opposite of what Aristotle said the tragic hero needed to have. But, as I have said before, Aristotle was very wrong in that respect. It's not that audiences cannot care or don't care about characters of low social status. It's quite the opposite. Audiences are just as likely, I would argue, far more likely, to care about characters who more closely resemble them than kings and queens and presidents and such do. But that having been said, Rambo is still a member of an elite group. At least it was an elite group when he's in Vietnam. Rambo's intentions, are they positive? Yeah, they are. He just wants to get something to eat and to continue on his way for much of the film. Where is he on the moral continuum, the spectrum, with entirely good at one end and entirely evil at the other? Does he fall at either end? He does not. We could argue he's closer to good than to evil, but he is not at either extreme. So, in 2 of 3 ways, Rambo fits Aristotle's description. Does Rambo have a tragic flaw? Does he have an example of hamartia? Yes. Yes, he does. And probably Rambo's hamartia also is hubris. He doesn't seem to have excessive arrogant pride all the way through the movie. But when Teasel drives him out of town, drives him across the bridge and says, yeah, there's a diner 30 miles up the highway, and then Teasel leaves, we see Rambo at the end of that bridge, and he looks one way, and he looks the other, and then he hoists his rucksack up on his back, and he very purposefully strides back across the bridge. He's had enough of this crap, basically. His pride has been hurt, and he is not going to put up with being treated this way. Okay, there you go. That, by the way, is a moment when Rambo could have averted the tragedy. And there are several of these moments that both Rambo and Teasle have throughout the film, where they could have stopped everything right at that moment. But they choose not to, driven by their pride. Other instances when Rambo could have, well, let's back up a little bit. Those instances where Rambo could have averted the tragedy but does not, yes, those show him definitely contributing to his own downfall. So, Rambo fits Aristotle's description of the tragic hero very well, except that he is not of high social status. But even though he is not of high social status, he does hold an elite status, or at least did at one time. And obviously, Rambo is our primary protagonist, and the antagonist toward him is Sheriff Teasle, Sheriff Will Teasle. Teasle also fits Aristotle's description of the tragic hero pretty well, because let's think about it. Teasle does hold an elite status in society. He's the sheriff. Everybody respects him. Everybody turns to him. The deputies, when they're in trouble, call out for him. Not just the townsfolk, but his own deputies. They feel a loyalty to him, it seems, and they depend on him to take care of them. So even though we don't like Teasle as people watching the movie, we are given the impression within the film that the other characters do, or at least they respect him. Does he have positive intentions? Yes, he does. At least initially. His intention is to keep his town safe or peaceful as he sees it. And that's why he takes Rambo out of town. Now, is that nice to Rambo? Is it fair to Rambo? No, it's not. But Teasle's intentions toward his community, in terms of what he is supposed to do as the sheriff, his intentions are positive. Is Teasle entirely good? No, certainly not. He's an ass. He's not someone you'd want to be around. At least I wouldn't want to be around him. But is he entirely evil? No, he's not. Teasle, like Rambo, falls somewhere in the middle of that moral spectrum or moral continuum. And does Teasle have a flaw? Does he have an example of hamartia? He does. And we can see it very easily, very clearly in Teasle. Teasle clearly suffers from hubris. His pride will not let him stop pursuing Rambo. When Teasle is in the tent, after Rambo has wiped out the posse in the woods, and Teasle's sitting in the tent, and the state police and so forth are all around, and Teasle's getting his head sewn up, the state police leader, Dave, I don't think Dave's given a last name, says, "You look like hell, Will. Why don't you go home? This is my problem now." But Teasle won't do it. Teasle says, "Don't give me any of your horseshit about jurisdiction on this one, Dave." Okay. Teasle is too proud to let the proper authorities now handle the situation. And when Troutman shows up and suggests the best way to handle this is just to let Rambo go, because they'll pick him up somewhere down the line, nobody will get hurt, there'll be no fight or anything like that. Teasle won't do it. At some point he has the line, "This is my job, Troutman. This is my town. I'm not giving it up to you or Rambo or anybody." Okay. Yeah. Teasle has a big old dose of hubris, and thereby he contributes to his own tragedy. Because like Rambo, he has several opportunities to just let things go, to stop what's occurring, and he doesn't take them because his pride won't let him. But let's talk about some of those instances where Rambo or Teasle could stop the tragedy, but they choose not to. Well, Teasle could just not hassle Rambo in the first place. That'd be easy since Rambo's not doing anything wrong. Rambo could choose not to walk back across that bridge into town after Teasle has hustled him out. But Rambo, very deliberately, we are shown, chooses to do that. What else do we have here? When they are, before the hunt out in the woods, after Galt has fallen to his death, Rambo comes out from behind the cliff with his hands up, and Teasle and the deputies are up on the cliff. And Rambo says he wants to give himself up. "There's one man dead. I don't want any more hurt." My awful Stallone impersonation. And Teasel could say, "Oh, okay, just stay right there. We'll be right down." But that's not what Teasel says. He says, "Don't make a move, boy, or I'll blow your head off," or something very similar to that. Well, that's probably not the best way to accept a surrender or to guarantee peaceful cooperation from that point, now is it? And now Rambo, though, could say, "Okay, I'm waiting right here." But he doesn't. He starts backing up. "But I didn't do anything." Oh, Rambo. And then Teasel, who within a few seconds shoots at him. And Rambo runs away, and yeah, you know how it goes from there. Soon after that comes the hunt in the forest, where Teasel and the deputies are ostensibly hunting Rambo, but clearly, as Mitch says, Rambo is hunting them. Teasel or Rambo, or both, could have stopped stopped everything from going downhill at that point when Rambo tries to give up, but they both elect not to. Oh, earlier, of course, in the jail, Rambo could have just cooperated with the deputies when they were trying to fingerprint him and so forth, but he didn't. Okay, he was very Gandhi-esque there, passive resistance. And then, of course, the deputies, they could have not been asses to him, but instead they especially Galt, they keep on and keep on till they trigger his PTSD, and Rambo freaks out, and then, all badness breaks loose. Teasel could stop everything, all the bad things that are going to happen, after Rambo takes out his deputies and him. And Rambo says, "Let it go." But Teasel, of course, won't. Teasel gets another opportunity to stop what's going to happen when, as we said, Dave, the state police guy, says, "Go home, this is now my problem." Teasel won't do it. His pride won't let him. Colonel Troutman arrives. And Troutman says, "Well, here's how we get out of this situation." And he says, "Stop everything. Let him go. Leave a hold in the armed people net, and Rambo will slip out, and we'll pick him up later." Teasel won't do that. When Troutman and Rambo are talking on the radio shortly thereafter, Rambo could listen to Troutman. He could take his advice and come in and give himself up. But he won't. After Rambo comes up out of the mine when everybody thinks he's dead, except Troutman, who has a suspicion he's alive, Rambo could just leave. But he doesn't. He goes back into town. He takes the war, as it were, back into town. And this is a way, by the by, in which Rambo is rather like the protagonist from epics. An epic, E-P-I-C, is a particular long sort of narrative poem. One of the things that happens in an epic is that the protagonist goes to hell, symbolically, sometimes literally, but then re-emerges, and upon re-emerging is changed, is different in some way. We see this in the Odyssey. We see this in book 4, I think, of Edmund Spenser's The Fairy Queen. We see this in The Lord of the Rings, which is technically not an epic because it's not a poem, but I don't care if it's a poem or not. It's epic in scope, and it's very epic in its action. When Gandalf is killed and goes to the afterlife or whatever, when he comes back, he's very different. When the Fellowship goes into the mines of Moria, and then they all emerge, except Gandalf, they are changed in a way. And when Rambo comes up out of that mine, he is different. He is an avenging spirit, as it were, and takes the war. Before he'd essentially been on the defensive, but now he goes on the offensive when he could just slip away. But there's no way he's going to do that now. His pride is completely in control, and he has made the switch into kill 'em mode. In this sense, Rambo, like the standard protagonist in an epic, is reborn. He emerges from the underworld, reborn and fundamentally changed. Our final thing here, the film is morally ambiguous. Both Rambo and Teasel, it seems, think they are in the right. Actually, this isn't quite our final thing. Let's stop for a moment. There's no supernatural in First Blood the way there is in Hamlet or the way there he is in Oedipus Tyrannus. In Death of a Salesman, there's no supernatural as such, but Willie's hallucinations, his psychological issues sort of fill in for the supernatural in that they are catalysts for his behavior. Because you notice in Oedipus the King and in Hamlet, that's what the supernatural does. It's a catalyst, it's a spark that prompts the protagonists to take action that tends out to be bad most of the time. And there is no supernatural as such in First Blood, but there is Rambo's PTSD, his emotional, his mental difficulties, which prompt him to take actions that generally are bad. And Troutman is kind of like a ghost from the past. We'll not say he's exactly like the ghost in Hamlet, because Troutman is actually alive, and he doesn't come back telling Rambo to go seek vengeance or something. He's more like a ghost that shows up and says, hey, why don't we put a stop to all this? But Troutman, in a sense, represents the past. So in that sense, he's kind of like the ghost from Hamlet. So supernatural things psychological things and the presence of Troutman fill in for the supernatural in First Blood. And so, like Oedipus the King, like Hamlet, like Death of a Salesman, we have a tragic protagonist, someone who's contributing to his own tragedy. We have the supernatural or fill-ins for the supernatural that prompt action. And we have a bad ending. And in the novel, the ending is more bad. I could just say worse, couldn't I? At least for Rambo, than the ending of the film is. Okay, and here's the last thing that we were starting to get into. The film is ambiguous, morally. And here's a term that you should know. The term is this. Sorry, I didn't have my cursor where it should be. The moral norm, also called the moral center. The moral norm, or the moral center of a work. Hi, hope that didn't make you dizzy. The moral norm, or the moral center, is the set of behaviors that a work suggests or advocates or something as being correct. Sometimes there is a character or characters who represent the moral norm. In Oedipus the King, Creon essentially is the moral norm. He's rational, he acts with thought, he does what he's supposed to do. In Hamlet, do we have a moral norm? Horatio, maybe, but I think that, we'll come back to Hamlet. In Death of a Salesman, the moral norm might be Biff, because despite Biff's flaws, when he shows up again at the Lohman household, he's trying to do the right thing. He's trying to behave appropriately. Although he doesn't succeed, he steals Mr. So-and-so's pen or whatever. In both Hamlet and First Blood, in Death of a Salesman, the moral norm is represented by Charlie, right? The neighbor, who is reasonable and tries to be nice and do the right thing and is not ruled by his ego and so forth. But Willie's pride won't let him follow that model. In both Hamlet and First Blood, the moral norm is suggested because the behavior of the primary characters is so clearly directly opposite of what it should be. And that, very frequently, is how you determine the moral norm or moral center of a work, by its absence, its conspicuous absence. Because we see characters doing things and behaving in ways and speaking in ways that clearly are not going to lead to anything good. And so we see that and we go, okay, not behaving like those guys of whatever gender, would be the way to go. That is the set of behaviors that the work is endorsing. That's a word that I was going to use. So in this film, it is morally ambiguous. Both Rambo and Teasle think that they are in the right. And, often audiences seeing First Blood, they're on Rambo's side because, well, he's Sylvester Stallone and Teasle is an ass. But when you stop and think about it, Rambo is really no more in the right once the film really gets going than Teasle is. So we have to sort of determine what the moral norm is by its absence. Maybe Troutman represents the moral norm. That's a possibility. Maybe Mitch, who is the deputy, the red-haired deputy, played by David Caruso, who is exactly the opposite of Deputy Galt, you know, the jackass with the handlebar mustache. Maybe Mitch represents the norm. Maybe Mitch represents the moral norm or the moral center, because Mitch consistently has common sense, appropriate responses to situations, which Teasle doesn't, and Galt doesn't, and Rambo doesn't. The ambiguity of right and wrong, the difficulty of finding the moral center, also shows up in conversations between Teasle and Troutman. When they think Rambo is dead in the mine, and they have an argument, and Teasle says, yeah, he was just another smart-ass drifter who broke the law. And Troutman says, vagrancy, wasn't it? That's going to look real good on his tombstone at Arlington. Here lies John Rambo, winner of the Congressional Medal of Honor, survivor of countless incursions behind enemy lines, killed for vagrancy in Jerkwater, USA. And then, which you're like, that's a good point. But Teasle then snaps right back. Don't give me that crap, Troutman. You think Rambo was the only guy who had a tough time in Vietnam? And we're kind of like, well, yeah, he clearly wasn't. He killed a police officer, for Christ's sake. And at that point, we're like, well, yeah, no, he didn't, actually. That was totally Galt's fault. Of course, Troutman's response, you're goddamn lucky he didn't kill all of you. Oh, quick footnote, we skipped over one of the coolest lines in all of movie history. When Troutman first tries to he shows up in Teasle's tent and says, let him go, let Rambo go. And Teasle won't do it. And Troutman says, you want a war you can't win? And Teasle says, you telling me 200 of our guys against your boys, a no-win situation for us? And Troutman says, well, you send in that many, don't forget one thing. Well, what's that? A good supply of body bags. Man, that's a great line. I love that line. Okay, sorry, that was a footnote. Back to the thing now, the ambiguity of right and wrong. When Teasle gets back to town, when they all think Rambo is dead, Teasle is clearly both physically and emotionally exhausted. He walks into the sheriff's office. He says, hold all my calls. He goes into his office, shuts the door, and just collapses in his chair. He's not doing a happy dance. He's not celebrating victory. Clearly, he is not entirely positive that things went as they should have gone. I think that's how we are to read that scene anyway. And then Teasle shows up at the bar. Actually, he showed up at the bar, I think, slightly before this, to apologize to Troutman. He says, look, if I was out of line before, I just want to apologize. And it's pretty difficult of him to get those words out, you'll note. This is really going against his sense of pride, his sense of self. I think we are meant to read the scene as, for him to apologize. But he does it because he's not completely certain. I think we're to see the character as not completely certain that he was in the right. So, yeah, the film's pretty ambiguous about who's right and who's wrong, if anybody is completely right or wrong. So, all right, that is the discussion of First Blood. I hope you enjoyed the movie. Go back and watch this video as many times as you need to. Pause it, and yeah, there we go.